Welcome back to the Bookshelf Odyssey. My name is Art, and today we're continuing to study and read along to Fahrenheit 451 by Ray Bradbury. And today we're covering the second half of part 2, The Sieve in the Sand. And we're seeing Montag's struggle to find and hold on to truth. This might end up being a quicker video because I'm about to go on vacation, and I'm really excited and looking forward to doing that. So we're going to try to get through this, and then I'll be off for a couple weeks. But where we left Montag, he has left Faber's house with Faber literally in his ear, and he goes back home. Along the way, he's talking with Faber, and when he gets home, Mildred's there, and she has invited some friends over to talk about, or to watch a new program called Cartoon Clown or something like that, or The White Clown. And it really sounds horrifying. You know, it's described as this in this video. It's just nonsense things. There were 3 white cartoon clowns chopped off each other's limbs to the accompaniment of immense incoming tides of laughter. 2 minutes more, and the room whipped out of town to the jet cars wildly circling in an arena, bashing and backing up and bashing each other again. Montag saw a number of bodies fly in the air. And Montag has had enough of this. You know, it's grotesque. It's numbing them to violence and empathy. And so he just goes and unplugs the TV. Maybe a interesting metaphor there. I don't know. Maybe we need to literally unplug ourselves at some point. And so, you know, Montag tells the ladies, let's talk, let's communicate, let's speak to each other. And, you know, he tries to bring up the war, and they're just reciting all the lies that they've heard about the war. And one of the ladies says, you know, about, you know, it's always somebody else's husband, they say, that dies at the war. And she says, I've heard that too. I've never known any dead men killed in a war. Killed jumping off buildings, yes, like Gloria's husband last week, but from wars? No. You know, and it's just this little offhand comment in this conversation, but to me, that's indicative of something that's not right in this society. You know, you're getting these little hints sprinkled throughout the conversations that society is sick, and this woman's husband just jumped off of a building, and it's like, you know, we don't care. We'll just share it like it's any kind of information. And then they quickly change the subject. Mildred does. You know, she says, did you see that Clara Dove 5-minute romance last night in your wall? Well, it was all about this woman who, you know, and he goes on talking. And, you know, Montag continues to encourage them, let's talk about you. Let's not talk about the TV. Let's talk about you. And they end up talking about children and say some pretty horrifying things about children, and how one, you know, doesn't want to have children and somebody else did, but, you know, they just shove them off to school 9 days out of 10. And when they get home, she plops them in front of the TV and doesn't actually take the time to interact with them and invest with them. And, you know, I shudder to think if that were to continue, what would happen to their society? You know, you'd create this society of children who are manipulated and fed false truths and are just expecting to be stimulated at all moments. They talk about politics, which I think is a very interesting discussion that ties in with the 1950s and 60s, you know, as time presented, or as time went on. But she says this, that Mrs. Bowles says that she voted for President Noble. I think he's one of the nicest looking men ever became president. Oh, but the man they ran against him, he wasn't much, was he? Kind of small and homely, and he didn't shave too close or comb his hair very well. What possessed the outs to run him? You just don't go running a little short man like that against a tall man. Besides, he mumbled. Half the time I couldn't hear a word he said, and the words I did hear, I didn't understand. Fat, too, and didn't dress to hide it. No wonder the landslide was for Winston Noble. Even their names helped. Compare Winston Noble to Hubert Hogue for 10 seconds, and you can almost figure the results. And then Montag gets frustrated. He says, you know, what do you even know about these two? And they said, well, they were right in that parlor wall not 6 months ago. One was always picking his nose. It drove me wild. And then Mrs. Phelps asked, did you want us to vote for a man like that? And Mildred's trying to get him out. I thought that was a very interesting discussion because in the 1950s, as television began to become more popular, people began to be able to see more regularly the people who are running for office. And I've heard it said that I think it was a Nixon-Kennedy debate, that the people who listened to it on the radio thought Nixon overwhelmingly won the debate. And it might not have been Nixon. I might be misremembering the name. But the people who watched it on television thought Kennedy won. He was a very nice, nice-looking man. And on the TV, he's probably more used to being on television than the other one was. It was all about the medium and presentation. And we see even that's still happening today. Even in our last recent elections, how, they'll talk about how good looking they are, or how accomplished they are, or how beautiful my wife is compared to somebody else's wife. And it really gets into dirty politics when you start talking about stuff like that, because it has nothing to do with running a country, and that's, I think what's horrifying is, somebody who might not look the part, but what they say has substance and has depth to it, but he's overlooked because of the whole idea of presentation, or she might be overlooked because of the whole idea of presentation. I think that's worth thinking about and remembering, to really look at a person's character, look at what they are saying, analyze how they behave and how they have behaved in the past and how they might behave in the future. And we see this often with politicians when they're asked a question and they just, say the same things over. And then you suddenly realize, wait a minute, that they didn't actually answer the question. They just said a couple of interesting sounding sound bites. And, let's stop doing that. Let's actually answer the questions. Let's give them substance. Let's look beyond the surface appeal and look for quality. That's my 2 cents worth. Because they have gotten used to being a visual society, that they will be told what to think and what to believe. And they are told, that somebody who looks nice and sounds great and is clean shaven and all that, that's what's good. And so, yeah, hey, we see somebody who's like that. And even down to the names, Winston Noble. Who wouldn't want to vote for a guy named Winston Noble versus Hubert Hogue? Poor Hubert. I bet he would have been a fine president. Anyway, so he gets down, he brings out a book. He's finally getting so frustrated. He brings out a book of poetry. Mildred is panic mode right now. She's like, firemen get to take one book home a year just to show everybody how silly it is. He reads poetry. And what I think is so interesting is that, and meanwhile, Faber's in his ear trying to tell him to be careful, stop doing it, don't do it. You got to burn the book. You got to try to cover, because the whole thing could come to an end now, just as it's getting started. But he reads this poem, and by the end of it, Mrs. Phelps is crying. And she's not quite sure why she's crying, but something in that poem just triggered that response. It made a connection with her that she hasn't had before. And then the response is that they all realize that these books are nasty. And so Montag sends them home and tells them to get out. And then just to kind of quickly sum up the rest of this part, Montag goes back to work, gets into a poker game with Beatty. Beatty is picking on him. He's antagonizing him. He's quoting things at him and talking about a dream that he had where they were in this battle of wits with literature. And Montag he just can't keep it together. He can't hold it together. And then the part 2 ends on a really lovely little cliffhanger. A fire call comes in. They get to the address. And through this whole thing, Beatty is just preening and mocking him and strutting around like he knows a secret. And then you finally realize at the end, Montag says, "We've stopped in front of my house." So we'll pick up in a couple weeks what happens next as far as the story goes. So as always, I would love to know your thoughts on this section. Like I had read, I found the visual-based society manipulated politics, how it's manipulating their government. And at their heart, again, they're nothing more than just narcissistic hedonists, as, again, I think it was SparkNotes said that. I love how quickly the friendship between Montag and Faber has been formed over their joint love of books. Montag, his newly found love versus Faber's longer love for books. And that, to me, is one of the joys of Booktube, that we're able to create friendships and have meaningful discussions using, video, using electronic communication, but we're able, to have very wonderful friendships and engaging conversations about things we love, and how I can just, in a couple of sentences, start talking with somebody who lives across the world who I never would have even known existed, but our love of books has brought us together. And that's fantastic. So I think that's neat, that it's seen, I think, in its infancy here with Montag and Faber. It's kind of funny to think that maybe one day, Booktube will be like this underground movement that, we might have to be on the run or hide books or something. I don't know, but hopefully one day booktubers will rule the world. But all that aside, we need to be careful as well. And I know I've seen videos about this and people wondering if, is Booktube actually harmful? Are we promoting reading books fast, or lying about the books we've read, or forcing people to read books that maybe they didn't want? Things like that I think are valid concerns. Even in the discussion about should we put ads on our videos or not. My point is, do what you want. I don't care. I have an ad blocker, so I don't see them anyway. So, sorry. I try to help support booktubers in other ways, and I'm not opposed, to earning money on a hobby at all. Certainly not. I mean, I do a couple podcasts, and I get like $5 a month for that from some generous people. So, I'm not here to get rich. Do what's authentic to your experience, to your interests, to your love. Use the technology we have, certainly, but use it with wisdom and use it to make those meaningful connections. So I really appreciate that we can use technology like this for those purposes. One of the things, too, I wanted to circle back to from the last week's video, and that is the title of part 2 is called The Sieve and the Sand. And I had mentioned and asked, how can we plug the holes in our sieve, as it were, as we're trying desperately to grab for truth, like Montag is, and it just feels like it's pouring right out of him. How can we plug the holes? Are we even supposed to plug the holes? I want to continue to think about that, talk about that. It's possible that books are what plugs the holes. It gives us the quality information, as Faber said in the last video that I shared, that quality information and the leisure time to study it, and then the right to act on it. I've been thinking a little bit too about that leisure time for reading. I sometimes want to be careful that I don't come across, I know I'm very privileged that, I have the time to read, and the time to read as much as I do. And I live in an area that has a public library. Actually, we have many public libraries, all within about a 20-mile radius, that I have cards to. I have money I'm able to afford to at least buy some books. There was a time in my life where we had, especially as a kid, we had hardly any money. And if it weren't for libraries, I would not have read because books were expensive, and they continue to be expensive. That an author has a right to earn a living based on their ability and skill. I'm not saying that at all. In fact, I heartily believe that. But in some aspects, we can come across as being a bit privileged, I think. So with all that, I am grateful that I've had the privilege to read good books and to communicate with you good folks out there. You have made me a better reader, and that is a wonderful privilege I'm so thankful for. But I think I might have gotten a little off topic there, but all that to say, make time for this. This is I think reading and sharing stories is so important and so necessary for our society right now. I live in a community that has a lot of elderly population to it, and sometimes you'll hear the variation on the theme of, oh, what's wrong with kids these days? What's wrong with the youths? And I always just respond, well, I think they just need to read more, which that's a very simplistic answer to a lot of the problems our society is facing. But I think there's some truth to it too. Read more, read to learn, read for enjoyment, read to share with others. All right, well, I've rambled quite a bit here at the end of this video. Next, we will be taking a 2-week break, at the very least, before we come back to part 3. So there is a slight possibility it might end up actually being 3 weeks. But I'll try to let you know that if that's the case. So we will start with part 3 in the next video. That part is called Burning Bright. And so we're going to kind of leave Montag here on a cliffhanger, and we'll find out what happens to him here in a few weeks. Let me know what you've thought about the reading so far. We'll keep our conversation going. So that'll be it for today. I look forward to coming back again in a couple weeks to continue our reading of Fahrenheit 451. So until next time, happy reading. Take care.